The city of Paris is beautiful. California, Berkeley is beautiful, but for me, they're period pieces. I'm not going to live in a city for that. I am more inspired with the crap that I see out of my window, so help me God.
We are here in the fifth floor galleries of the Whitney in an exhibition titled Collection View, Louise Nevelson, which is an exhibition of work of Nevelson's sculptures, all drawn from the Whitney's collection that spans over 40 years of the artist's career. One of the things that was particularly exciting to me about imagining her sculptures in this space, which has these incredible east-facing windows looking out over the downtown Manhattan skyline, is that New York was a longtime inspiration for Nevelson. She was fascinated by the skyline, by watching buildings go up, other buildings come down, and many of the materials that she used for her sculptures were materials that she gathered from the city streets. Nevelson lived in New York City for almost 70 years. She was born in 1899 in Ukraine and moved to the United States in 1905 with her family. They first moved to Rockland, Maine, and it was in 1920 that she first moved to New York. A few years after this, she begins to study at the Art Students League, and she really becomes embedded in the New York art scene. During Nevelson's earliest years in New York, between the 1920s and 1930s, the city itself was in a phase of tremendous change. This was kind of the moment of the skyscraper. And Nevelson has said that she saw New York City as a great big sculpture, and that she loved watching and witnessing the changing heights of the city, the changing cityscape. And I think this is something that influenced her and inspired her in much of her work. It wasn't actually until a bit later in her career, in the early 1950s, that Nevelson began really gathering material from the city around her as a source for her sculptural work. Nevelson purchased a home and studio in Kips Bay on East 30th Street in 1945. And this was a site where she began to really see and notice the demolition going on around her. This is obviously not far from that kind of center of Midtown where so many of the skyscrapers were being built at the time and other areas were being razed. And it was in the early 1950s that she began to use materials from these sites of demolition and recognize their artistic potential. In fact, Nevelson's work itself has an interesting dialogue with architecture. And you can think about the grids of the city, banisters, cornices, crown moldings, elements of buildings themselves that are embedded in the work. She was known to scavenge the city streets at night often, dragging materials home to her studio, and some really wonderful photographs of her studio during this period show this incredible space that had strips of wood, banisters, all different types of gathered materials that she would bring together, line up, kind of categorize, and then paint to be one single color. And this was a big part of how she would ultimately, in her final sculptures, almost cloak the specificity of the objects that she was gathering in order to bring them into these formal conversations that could be almost read as abstractions, even as the closer you look, the more you notice these sort of everyday objects that are embedded in the work. For this exhibition, we wanted to bring a range of Nevelson sculptures from the collection together, starting with work from the 1940s, which are her static moving figures directly behind me, in the same grouping as another really important work of Nevelson's called Black Majesty, the first work purchased by the Whitney of Nevelson's, made in 1955 and purchased by the Whitney in 1956. We also have works like her walls that she's perhaps best known for, these works that are assemblages of materials presented against a gallery wall. And we've also included works like Nevelson's rainforest columns, which are freestanding sculptures, also assembled from found materials, but have a very different presence than her wall works. And even going to her later works like the dream houses. And we have one great example of a dream house in the exhibition as well. One of my personal favorite works in the exhibition is Black Cord. It's one of Nevelson's wall sculptures from 1964, and it's really classic Nevelson. In 1957, she received, as a gift from friends at Christmas time, a crate of wine. And she took the greatest interest in the crate itself and realizing that this could be filled with other objects and also was stackable. And so Nevelson would gather crates, then gather the various materials that she was collecting from the city streets, then paint them all in one color, assemble the elements into each crate, and then each crate was stacked side by side and then stacked above in the rows. Black Cord, because of the way that the objects fill these crates, there's incredible shadow play. There is an incredible change that happens in the work at different times of the day. Something that was always very important to her was these interesting contrasts or almost conversations between two ideas, whether that was lightness and darkness, sunlight and shadow, movement and stillness. I also love that although Nevelson worked for many years in a home and studio in Kips Bay on East 30th Street, she spent her later years working as an artist on Spring Street in downtown Manhattan. So there's a sense that the skyline, the streets, the buildings that we're looking out on from this gallery in the presence of her work, these are also the spaces that she was around. Some of the tops even of Nevelson's rainforest columns, I always think have interesting echoes with actual New York City skyscrapers. And from these galleries, you can look out the windows and see the top of the Empire State Building. And so there's a way that there's this kind of direct question mark there of like, is there some link here between these are the buildings that were inspiring her? And I think it's rare to have an opportunity to actually see sculpture like this in that kind of direct dialogue with such buildings. During Nevelson's lifetime, the city was changing a great deal, but it still is today. So I think here we are in downtown Manhattan on Gansevoort Street and looking out at a landscape that includes older buildings, new buildings, lots of scaffolding, always construction. So there's something of that echo. I mean, I think there will always be that echo in a city like New York of a place that is constantly changing and is in that way a great big sculpture.